Hello, everyone. Very good afternoon or very good morning, the case may be. We are delighted to have the chance to have as our speaker today at the New Work seminar, Harriet Flower, who's Andrew Fleming West Professor of Classics at Princeton, and whose work on the Roman Republic and more broadly on Roman history over the last 25 years or so has been, nothing short of transformative and deeply inspirational to all of us in all sorts of ways. Ancestor masks and aristocratic power in Roman culture, the art of forgetting, disgrace and oblivion in Roman political culture, Roman republics, of course. And in 2017, the dancing Lares and the serpent in the garden, religion in at the Roman street corner, are really landmarks in the study of the Roman Republic, and indeed some of the most innovative pieces of scholarship to have appeared in ancient history in this generation. And of course, the Cambridge Companion to the Roman Republic that she edited has had a major impact on how the subject is taught, not just in the English-speaking classroom. Today, we have the chance to hear about some of her ongoing work on women and their agency in Roman politics. So some of you will be, of course, familiar with the great piece on Servilia that came out in a 2018 volume on institutions and ideology in the Roman Republic. And today we are turning to, more political conversations in Roman houses in the Republic, but we are going back in time, political conversations at the house of Sulpicia in 186 BC. Harriet, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Yeah. This is such a pleasure to be invited to speak to this group. And thank you all for coming. I hope you won't be disappointed by what's a fairly small case study, but I am trying to use this case study to address larger questions about how we talk about particularly women in Republican Rome, and how and whether we can talk about women before that generation of the late Republic that's been such a focus for so much work on women, the generation of Cicero and Caesar and the women that are very well known. This paper started life at a conference that was partly on space, so there is a beginning bit on space, but I'm just going to read it as it is. I hope you have the handout. There are many ways in which I think we could go in discussing this piece, and I'm really interested to hear what you think. Okay, so the analysis of space provides a vital framework for understanding interactions between individuals and groups within an ancient city. Even in a large city like Rome, communication happened face to face, and written messages also needed to be delivered personally by hand. Recreating conversations, negotiations, and the ways in which information traveled in the urban landscape of Republican Rome necessarily involves a consideration of the spaces in which each personal and political interaction took place. We have a significant body of ancient evidence about debates in the Senate, interactions at morning receptions, the salutationes of politicians in their homes, and speeches given at public meetings, contiones in the forum or elsewhere. These much discussed events were held in a variety of settings: domestic, public, sacred, or open air. The Senate, for example, met in a different consecrated location designated each time by the presiding magistrate for that particular meeting. Meanwhile, behind these better attested examples, there were clearly many others held in venues and on occasions that are simply less often described in our surviving sources, without necessarily being less frequent or influential in Roman life. And I know we all are aware of Cristina Rocio Lopez's important work and her new book on political conversations in Rome. In this essay, I will focus on how political conversations conducted both by magistrates and by other Roman citizens could and did happen in houses owned by Roman women. So this is rather a specific topic, but I do think it holds promise for further analysis on several interrelated subjects. So 3 topics come to my mind immediately. Firstly, the uses of domestic space. Secondly, gender relations. And thirdly, political communication or decision-making in the setting of a private house in Rome. And here I'm looking at the grand houses in Rome owned by Rome's political leaders, the nobiles. And here you have, I'm at number 1 on the handout. I will concentrate on these houses, but I do not mean to imply in any way that political conversations are not also happening in many other domestic and commercial spaces throughout the city, including the most modest. I think everybody's talking about politics in Rome. But a big home offered a series of rooms with different levels of access or privacy, depending on its architectural configuration and on the time of day when each conversation took place. Such a house was often crowded, having been specifically built to be in the public eye, where it was watched by the curious who passed by or who lived in the neighborhood. During the Republican period, many of these nobiles chose to live on the Palatine or in the Sacra Via, both neighborhoods near the Forum. Much important work has already been done, obviously, on the Domos, not a strictly private or purely domestic environment. Roman politicians did not have offices where they could conduct political, financial, or other business that was not transacted in the Forum. Consequently, many discussions and negotiations happened at home or in the house of a friend or relative. The obvious example is the morning salutatio, which unsurprisingly ancient sources do not specify when this custom became a habitual practice, as it's attested in the 1st century BC. In addition, of course, dinner parties of various sizes were also common in the houses of the affluent. For example, Plutarch claims that Cato the Elder already regularly entertained guests for dinner at his house in the early 2nd century. Similarly, research has also moved beyond the analysis of oratory in the Senate, law court, or contio, and published speeches or pamphlets to consider rumor and informal political conversations, which were a constant feature of life in Rome. The typically Roman custom of convening a concilium or personal group of advisors in order to discuss an important decision is already attested in the 3rd century BC and may in fact be much older. The Roman Senate itself operated as a kind of concilium. And here you can see under number 2 and 3 on the handout, there's some bibliography. Domestic concilia met in houses belonging to family members, either in town or outside. Romans of the leisured classes took the opportunities these locations afforded them to debate and discuss matters, familial or political, in a variety of group settings. In the morning, in the bedroom, in the atrium, over dinner, in the dining area, in reception rooms, or in outdoor spaces. And here we can evoke something like the setting of Cicero's Brutus, which has people sitting out of doors, but at Cicero's house in Rome. Meanwhile, we know and should remind ourselves more often that such large and opulent house could be owned by a woman. And here we have something under number 4 on the handout. Roman women could legally own all kinds of property, whether real or movable. They gained increasing control over the management of their wealth during the 2nd century BC. The growing tendency for such propertied women to marry without becoming legally subject to their husbands or without manus, a development at the same time apparently, also gave them more independence because they remained members of their birth family and did not pass under legal control of a husband or his relatives. So as the empire expanded into the Eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd century BC, Political families rapidly grew wealthier, even as their women were gaining more flexibility in legal control over property of all kinds. All these factors worked together to result in houses owned by wealthy women, especially widows. So in this next part, I talk about what it is to look for these women's houses in Republican Rome. And this is under number 5. So we have Israel Schatzman's classic 1975 survey of senatorial wealth, and we have useful entries under Domus in the multi-authored Lexicon Topographicum Urbis Romae of the 1990s. Both of these familiar works take remarkably little account of Republican women as home owners. In fact, even property that is specified in an ancient source as belonging to a wife's dowry is not infrequently simply attributed to her husband in these reference works. In most cases, any children would eventually inherit property owned by a woman in question. Inheritance could yield a male or female owner in the next generation. Consequently, using these reference works to make any kind of inventory of Republican houses owned by women is challenging. In the case of the Lexicon Topographicum, the situation is made potentially more confusing by the fact that many women proprietors are listed for the imperial period. Over 60 entries are included in El Tour. Their names are almost exclusively taken from inscriptions on water pipes, fistulae aquariae, some of which seem to have been found in situ. This distinct body of epigraphic evidence serves as a salutary reminder of how often wealthy women were able to acquire real property within the city. Roman women could inherit houses from parents, relatives, or friends, have access to them as part of their dowry, or own them in a personal account, a peculium, that they could control separately from the dowry. In addition, they could legally buy and sell houses and land with cash or other financial instruments. A pattern similar to these 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century AD inscriptions seems to extend into late antiquity, since several of the house churches, which are called tituli, listed in El Tour, have the names of women attached to them. In these instances, legal ownership may not be as clearly attested. Some of these women may be renters, but the overall picture is still suggestive. In other words, if one simply relied on this topographical dictionary, one could easily get the impression that women regularly owned houses in the imperial and later periods, but only very rarely in Republican Rome. I believe there's no particular reason to think that this is an accurate legal or economic picture. So the existence of female homeowners is easiest to see in the mid-1st century, as we can see, in that late Republican period so well attested by Cicero. And here I have some of the obvious suspects under number 6 on the handout. Prominent women such as Clodia, wife of Metellus Celer, her sister-in-law Fulvia, wife of Clodius the Tribune, Cicero's wife Terentia, and Servilia, mother of Marcus Brutus the tyrannicide, are well documented as wealthy individuals who controlled diversified portfolios of investments that included houses and land that produced income. Divorce and the death of a husband, both frequent occurrences, naturally resulted in these women living in their own houses at various times in their lives, especially in cases where women had married much older men. Here, I want to obviously draw attention to Susan Treggiari's recent studies, both of the women in Cicero's family and especially of Servilia in her family context, that have shed new light on many aspects of property ownership and management. Similarly, the historian Appian records a public speech delivered in 42 BC by Hortensia, daughter of the famous orator Quintus Hortensius. This is under number 8, in which she is critical of the triumvirate of Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus. In this speech, women's property rights are presented as essential and inviolable. an integral aspect of their status as Roman citizens and as members of their own families and extended kinship groups. Two earlier texts noted in separate entries in the topographical dictionary offer brief glimpses of Republican women as homeowners of the kind described by Hortensia in the late 40s. Under number 9 on the handout, in one of his first public speeches, the Pro Sexto Roscio of 80, Cicero shows how a certain Caecilia Metella gave refuge in her house to his client Sextus Roscius during Sulla's notorious proscriptions in the late 80s BC. Cicero indicates that young Roscius lived with Caecilia for some time. The generous Caecilia's status as a homeowner is evident, but not a topic for comment. It is simply taken for granted as background to the turbulent events Cicero is describing. No husband is mentioned, which would most logically suggest that Caecilia was unmarried at the time, although this has been disputed. But she clearly is using her own resources to support Roscius, who had inherited a traditional relationship of hospitium with her family. Under number 10 on the handout, over 20 years later, Cicero claimed that the consul of 58 BC, Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus, had watched the destruction of Cicero's own house on the Palatine from a neighboring property, one that belonged to Piso's mother-in-law. According to the Roman historian Fenestella, this woman was the wife, perhaps by now the widow, of a certain Publius Rutilius Nudus. Her house is immediately opposite Cicero's on the north slope of the Palatine. Because the mother-in-law's name is not attested, the topographical dictionary lists the house under her daughter's husband, Piso Caesoninus. Yet evidently he did not live with his mother-in-law. Interestingly, her name is already lost when Asconius wrote a commentary on Cicero's speech in the 50s AD. So let me sum up my background introduction so far. Many wealthy women surely owned large houses in Republican Rome, on the Palatine, and in other desirable locations. Some husbands, including those who held the highest political offices, lived in houses owned by their wives during at least some of their married life. Other rich women lived independently in their own homes without a husband, either as widows or after a divorce. Property ownership gave wealthy Roman women the opportunity to live independently and to be fully in charge of their own domestic space, particularly in middle or older age, when there might be no real need or desire to remarry in order to have more children. Demographic factors will have left a number of women no longer married, especially at older ages. Moreover, before the passage of the Lex Waconia in 169 BC, there seem to have been no legal limits on the amount of property women could inherit. Indeed, even after that law, clearly Roman families had a way of getting around property rules. The use of property held outside dowry and a peculium was another strategy. Given the legal and economic situation of the city as it grew, especially in the 2nd century, it is reasonable to try and look for some evidence for women's houses and for what life looked like inside these spaces. So now I want to focus on my case study of Sulpicia, mother-in-law of Spurius Posthumous, the consul of 186. She emerges as a character in Livy's narrative of the events of that year. These events took place in the first generation after the Hannibalic War, and therefore before the passage of the Lex Waconia. The passing of the Lex Waconia itself suggests that women of the upper classes had been accumulating significant wealth in conspicuous ways precisely during the early part of the century. And I have some references on number 11 on the handout. This caused the issue of women's property to become a concern to the Senate and to magistrates. Plautus's plays, some perhaps from the late 3rd century BC, include jokes about wealthy wives and about women's resources in general. Presumably, these themes reflected contemporary concerns that the audience would readily appreciate and were ready to laugh about. Similarly, fragments of several of Cato's speeches delivered in the 190s and 180s indicate that women's wealth overall, as well as their independent deployment of these assets, had become a topic for public debate, although the precise details and context of these discussions remain largely lost. Plautus may also be parodying Cato and other contemporary commentators. I cannot go on without mentioning the notorious dowries of the 2 daughters of Scipio Africanus, 50 talents each, under number 12 on the handout. These are clearly agreed upon before the Lex Walconia. Africanus's wife, Tertia Aemilia, would have been a probably significantly younger contemporary of the Sulpicia, who is the focus of this discussion. Scipio's wife, also a patrician, had a high profile in Rome and was known for her displays of personal wealth, especially in religious processions of matrons, but also in the clothes and jewels she regularly wore in public. Her ostentatious displays of luxury, including the number of attendants who carried her precious personal items, are described by Polybius as reflecting the riches her husband had won when he defeated the Carthaginians, rather than her own inherited or dotal property. Even before, but especially after the repeal of the Lex Oppia in 195, such spectacles of lavish, conspicuous consumption had apparently become acceptable and even expected for the most prominent women. Aemilia was still alive and seems to have been living in Rome at the time of the events discussed in 186, the famous Bacchanalia. So, under number 13 on the handout, my case study involves the background to the famous Bacchanalian affair and its violent suppression, 15 years after the end of the Second Punic War. A new type of initiation cult in honor of Bacchus was apparently discovered and suppressed by the Roman authorities over several years, with significant loss of life. Livy's detailed account of this colorful episode early in Book 39 remains much treated by modern scholars. Almost every aspect has remained up for discussion. Nevertheless, my topic of women's houses does not depend on a particular interpretation of Livy's political or religious narrative. It merely presupposes that the social, domestic, and topographical background in the city would have made sense to a Roman audience. My analysis posits that the main characters are indeed historical, but a similar argument could also be made, albeit in a different way, if they were partly or mostly invented. The point is that the setting of the story needed to be plausible to Livy's readers and did not require any explanatory glosses from him. This same reasoning applies at one step removed to his sources amongst the earlier authors of historiographical texts. So, as you all know, Livy's narrative revolves around the consul Spurius Posthumous Albinus, who claims suddenly to discover the dire truth about a new initiation cult of Bacchus that he then proceeds to suppress, using the army, special judicial tribunals, and even the death penalty for Roman citizens. The initial plot is set in motion by a series of conversations that take place in houses owned by women. 2 women, Ibutia, a widow of equestrian status living on the Aventine, and Sulpicia, the patrician mother-in-law of the consul Posthumous, surely also a woman who is a widow. So some people, as you know, dismiss the whole narrative as based on a comic play in a Greek style, and this is under number 14. However, the context of political conversations inside houses belonging to women seems a particularly Roman one that is not easily paralleled in a Greek model or in a Greek cultural context. Near the beginning of the episode, the conversations in the women's houses provide the consul with the evidence and witnesses that he needs to proceed against the new cult in the city. And this is under number 15. We start with this. Without re-examining the details of religious practice or of its suppression by the Senate, I will analyze the spatial and social framework as represented by Livy, which he will presumably have taken from his sources. In essence, Livy presents a story of two wealthy widows, Aibutia and Sulpicia, who are described as independent actors, while information is shared and events unfold. Each woman lives in her own home and not with a husband or in an extended family group. The whole episode begins when a young man named Aibutius is sent away from his family home on the Aventine by his mother Duronia and his stepfather Titus Sempronius Rutilius, after Aibutius refuses to be initiated into the new Bacchanalian cult. Aibutia has been warned about this cult by his lover, a freedwoman prostitute named Hispala Ficenia. When his parents expel him, he takes refuge at the house of his aunt Aibutia, a widow who is the sister of Aibutius's deceased father, a man of equestrian status. She lives nearby, still on the Aventine, where this Aibutii family seems to have acquired several properties, perhaps even physically connected with each other. Aibutius is now able to live with his aunt and follows her advice about what to do next. Aibutia offers her nephew a refuge, just as a Caecilia Metella will receive and support the young Roscius in her house almost a century later, as we saw. It is Aibutia who advises the young man to go directly to the consul Posthumous and to tell him what he has learned about the cult and how his family is trying to force him to join it. The location for Aibutius's initial private interview with the consul seems to be in Posthumous's own house, perhaps at a morning salutatio. Aibutius is told to return in a few days' time. The most decisive and detailed scenes involving the consul Posthumous, however, take place in the house of his mother-in-law Sulpicia. It is in this setting that Posthumous meets both Aibutia and Hispala on separate occasions. Posthumous and Sulpicia each came from ancient patrician families. It is no surprise to see a marriage alliance between their clans, and you have something under number 16. Posthumous must still be married to Sulpicia's daughter at the time, since she is called his mother-in-law, but nothing is said of Sulpicia's husband or of her daughter's name. Posthumous, we assume, is perhaps in around 40 or a little older during his consulship. We know he had a son, Lucius, the future consul of 154, who should therefore be perhaps around 10 years old in 186. But maybe he is not the firstborn, since this little Lucius is not named after his father. Consequently, Posthumous's wife, if she is the mother of Lucius, will have been married for maybe around 12 years, perhaps a little longer. Her mother, Sulpicia, therefore could be around 50 and a widow. Livy's text repeatedly refers explicitly to the house that Sulpicia lives in as being hers. It is the privacy, security, and prestige of the particular domestic setting in Sulpicia's house that Posthumous uses to effect his plan. And this is true whatever you may think of his plan, whether you think he is seeking real information or fabricating his own conspiracy, or a combination of both. We see this under number 17. Here he is able to meet Aibutia as if by chance in an encounter organized by Sulpicia. On this occasion, he asks Aibutia casually in conversation about her nephew's situation. In this same house, but in a private room, Posthumous interviews Hispala in the presence of Sulpicia, and is described as constraining the freedwoman to act as his witness against the Bacchanalian cult. This is under number 18 in Interiorem Partem Ideum. Subsequently, a private apartment is arranged on an upper floor of the house where Hispala can take refuge with her household of enslaved people after she has agreed to testify publicly against the cult. Her lover, Aibutius, is lodged safely with a client of the consul, no longer at the house of his aunt, Aibutia, in the old neighborhood. Hispala, that's number 19. Hispala is sent to live in the house of Sulpicia, a location that is described as completely safe, even in a time of turmoil. So here we see the background to the story. The high social prestige of Sulpicia is a key factor in the role she's able to play. At the same time, it is the house she owns that provides the locale for the consul's actions. Her social status is intricately linked to the house she lives in. It should be evident that the consul also has his own house, perhaps nearby. The way in which the action unfolds clearly indicates that Posthumous and his family do not live with the mother-in-law. Above all, what I think is so interesting is that it is practical for the consul to have these conversations at Sulpicia's house and to enlist her help with gaining information and persuading witnesses who are women to testify. Yet Posthumous has both a wife and a house of his own. A modern reader can easily imagine these same scenes playing out at his house and in the presence of his wife. But Sulpicia's house was preferable. Why was this the case? Sulpicia's house offers a more private venue and provides the logical place to access her own social network of female contacts, including Aibutia, a wealthy widow she seems to be on familiar terms with, a woman who may perhaps be somewhat older since she is referred to as Anos. Sulpicia herself will not have held a morning salutatio in a way that a father, brother, husband, or son could have done. Entry to her house will not ever have been as open and accessible as the houses of politicians often were during daylight hours, especially when they were holding high political office. And here we may recall the custom of keeping the door open to a house regularly. Meanwhile, what strikes me is that Posthumous the consul can easily visit his mother-in-law regularly. Effectively, in this narrative, he seems to be doing it on a daily basis, and he is not in the company of his wife, apparently, without arousing comment, surprise, or suspicion. In fact, the whole series of conversations and decisions is based on the idea that frequent visits to Sulpicia's house are an accepted social norm that would not arouse attention of other people. On the day when Posthumous meets Hispala, he is specifically said to be accompanied not only by his lictors, but also by a crowd, which is termed turba consularis, of other attendants customary for a consul. Who are all these people anyway? Were they with him every day he was in office, following him around everywhere? The whole group waits around, some perhaps in the atrium, others perhaps standing outside her front door, while the consul then meets in a very private space with his mother-in-law Sulpicia and the freedwoman Hispala, who is easily able to pass by these attendants without them taking note of her. Traditional Roman atrium houses usually only have a single front entrance. The logic of the setting suggests that Hispala can behave as if she has other business in the household, not with the consul, who has arrived for one of his habitual visits with his mother-in-law. Unsurprisingly, Hispala is represented as being afraid to give evidence, fearing reprisals from members of the Bacchic cult, and even wanting to leave Italy to get away from them. Posthumous is then said to lose patience with her and remind her both whom she is speaking with, a consul, and whose house she is in, the house of a woman described as an exceptional individual, under number 20, gravissima femina. Here, as elsewhere, the house is vital to the story. It is clearly a large and impressive house. The atrium will have featured the wax ancestor masks or imagines of the patrician Sulpicii and of their political relatives, undoubtedly an exceptionally impressive assemblage. But we also see that Sulpicia's house contains a range of different interior rooms for entertaining visitors. The narrative implies that Aibutia sat with Sulpicia in a public reception area where Posthumous could pretend to come by chance. By contrast, Hispala is described as being received in a much more private interior space for a more confidential conversation. Hispala may perhaps be able to reach this inner chamber by way of a servant's corridor out of sight of the visitors at the entrance of the house. We also see under number 19 that Sulpicia's house has the apartments I've already mentioned on the upper floors, that cenacula, that can be reached by external staircases. Her dependents and freedmen will usually be living in these, or perhaps even other tenants who paid rent. Hispala's apartment now has its external stairs removed and is made exclusively accessible from inside Sulpicia's own domestic space. It is not clear whether the apartment set aside for Hispala is imagined as having been accessible from inside the house before, or whether a whole new entryway is constructed to accommodate her new secret place. This text may imply that these apartments are usually designed to be completely separate from the main house. Sulpicia surely has a large household staff who enable her high standard of living. It is these people who provide security for the whole complex. Hispala will be safe here, not only because of Sulpicia's reputation and social prestige, but also because of her practical domestic situation. Her house is large and very well protected. As readers of Livy's account, we're supposed to be able to imagine every aspect of this grand house and its regular inhabitants as they come and go throughout the day, as a background to the narrative. The house itself implies the immense wealth and influence of the patrician Sulpicia. Each of the named characters visits her. We do not see her going out at all, or meeting people in public places or at religious festivals. Her influence on social interactions can be understood in relation to her control of the space for each conversation. When she sends an invitation, people come to call on her at the appointed time. Similarly, her son-in-law, although we may imagine he is a busy man during his year of being consul, still regularly visits perhaps every day as a matter of routine. Information is continually being acquired and exchanged in these visits, even as Posthumous's social networks interconnect with Sulpicia's. Although she doesn't have a salutatio that a man might have, regular visits take place. So this makes me wonder about other receiving hours that may be customary for women. And I'm so glad that Federico said at the beginning, there's still time for another cup of tea. You know, in each culture, there is a time to meet. Is it tea time? Is it the cocktail hour? We all know in our cultural setting when the time is when we can drop by or we can invite people and they say, oh yes, this is the moment for me to come and pay a visit. The logic of the narrative does not require a special excuse for his visits. So we see an interaction of space with time of day to produce confidential conversations. Livy's discourse here enacts the normative social roles of each participant within their habitual spaces. So then I come to the question which is under number 21, who is Sulpicia, mother-in-law of Posthumous? And so one can pose this question in various ways. There's obviously the basic prosobiographical, here we are doing Roman history way of posing this question. And then there's the question of whether it matters to ask this question at all. And I'm going to try to pose it in both ways. So Sulpicia's central role in the narrative leads naturally to this question. Can we identify her? Münzer, who designated her as number 108, thought there was no way to say any more about her or about her life than what's in Livy at the beginning of book 39. Others have proposed identifying her as the same Sulpicia, number 107, who was chosen by a special group of her peers as the most chaste matron in Rome to dedicate a statue of Venus Verticordia on the advice of the Sibylline books at an unstated date. People have dated this statue to many different times, some people during the Hannibalic War, some people even before the Hannibalic War. According to Münzer, this exceptionally chaste and pious Sulpicia, number 107, was the daughter of an otherwise unattested Servius Sulpicius Paterculus. And you have all this on the handout. So I'm sorry that it's a bit, technical here, but the pious Sulpicia, wife of the leading 3rd century politician and general Quintus Fulvius Flaccus, 4 times consul, 237, 224, 212, 209. The stress on Posthumous' mother-in-law's personal prestige, which Livy brings out by the repeated, almost insistent use of the relatively rare adjective gravis, which is not as often used, especially for women, and even its superlative form gravissima might fit in with the pious Sulpicia's special standing amongst other women of her social class. But why then does Livy not specify which woman she is? Perhaps he or his source already don't know exactly which Sulpicia she is. If the mother-in-law of Posthumous is the wife of Quintus Fulvius Flaccus, then something more of her life can be discerned. Again, not surprising to see the marriage alliance between Posthumi and Fulvii. In this case, Sulpicia's daughter would have been a Fulvia, who had 3 brothers we know of. The eldest, Quintus Fulvius Flaccus, same name as his father, would go on in a unique configuration of shared office holding to be consul in 179, together with his younger brother, who had then been adopted by Manlius, 2 brothers consul together. In 186, Quintus would have been near the beginning of his political career and would be curule aedile 2 years later. He may therefore already have held the office of quaestor and been attending Senate meetings. He was in his early 30s, but apparently not living with his mother. Rather, he also will have had his own house and presumably been married by now. His career would go on to be distinguished, including a consulship, 2 triumphs in consecutive years, and the office of censor. Quintus's sister Fulvia may have been just a couple of years younger than him, in her late 20s or around 30, with a son, Lucius Posthumous, around 10, and a husband some 10 years her senior. Her mother Sulpicia, therefore married by 220 or a bit earlier, as is indicated by the career of her eldest son. On this model, she would have belonged to the generation born around 240, immediately after the First Punic War. Her husband Fulvius was therefore much older than she was. She would surely not have been his first wife. Interestingly, this very circumstance is indeed suggested by the unusual interval of age, 58 years between the first consulship of the father Quintus and of the son of the same name. He must be an old dad. The elder Fulvius is attested as still being alive in 205. Sulpicia, whom I'm imagining as a woman in her early to mid-50s, had presumably been a widow for many years. In other words, this identification fits chronologically in various ways, in terms of social standing and in light of political connections. Her wealth and surviving children allowed and perhaps encouraged Sulpicia to remain a widow, with the special social prestige of a woman who'd only had a single husband, an uni vira. On the other hand, the mother-in-law of Posthumous could, of course, easily be a different Sulpicia, a relative born in the same generation as Fulvius's wife, possibly a sister or a first cousin. As it is already noted, it is not so surprising that these women who all had the same name were not easy for later writers to identify individually. In 186, more than one Sulpicia could have been a grand widowed lady living in her own spacious house. Indeed, an alternative Sulpicia could be interpreted as equally, if not even more revealing about the general situation of such women in Rome in the early 2nd century BC. In the imperial period, inscriptions on water pipes attest 3 Sulpiciae that I give you under number 22 on the handout. Sulpicia Paccata, Sulpicia Praetextata, and Sulpicia Triaria, all on inscriptions. Similarly, in the 1st century BC, of course, the notorious tribune of the plebs, Publius Clodius, had 3 sisters called Clodia or Claudia, each prominent and wealthy, but not easy for us to tell apart sometimes. What difference does it make if Cicero's target in the Procailio, Clodia, the wife of Metellus Celer, was identical with Catullus's lover, Lesbia, or whether that lady was one of her 2 sisters? Okay, so thank you for your patience with this prosopography. I want to move on to a conclusion. And I think we should feel happy to discuss whether doing this prosopography is worth it or not. So return to 186 BC and to the social world of Posthumous' mother-in-law. Livy and presumably his sources present us a picture of how political conversations of considerable sensitivity and wide impact could be staged, or at least easily imagined as being staged, by a consul in a house owned by a wealthy and influential female relative, in this case, his wife's widowed mother. Livy implies that such a space was regularly used in ways that complemented and supplemented other political spaces in the city, whether the houses of magistrates or the meeting places of the Senate. On this occasion, the gendered character of the space is a distinct advantage for the consul. It is emphasized by the fact that Sulpicia is present for each interview. In other words, Posthumous is not simply using rooms in Sulpicia's house while she's out for the day or away from Rome. Meanwhile, this house will have had the same architectural design as houses owned by men. It may well have been a family house passed down by inheritance or dowry settlement. Appreciating the use of space in a woman's house means we also need to take seriously the political effects of a range of private conversations that took place in these spaces, whether between women or between women and men. Such conversations stand a step removed from the concilium, but could presuppose or lead into such a family council. In 186, each interaction makes its own contribution to a web of knowledge accessed by a consul that had powerful results in the more public sphere of Roman political life, and even throughout Italy. In the context of the 180s, women living in their own houses were already taken for granted, whether a patrician Sulpicia or an equestrian Aubutia, or even the entrepreneurial freedwoman Hispala Ficenia, whose affair with a much younger lover is logically imagined as happening in her space, since he still lives with his parents who do not approve of his liaison. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Harriet. Thank you very much indeed. It was wonderful, and yes, I'm sure that the discussion can take us in a number of directions. So yes, I'm opening the floor for questions, comments. Well, I have a small question while people collect their thoughts, unless I'm overlooking a raised hand already. My question is whether you can think of other cases in which a senior public figure, like our consul here, appears to have such a close bond with his mother-in-law, as opposed to his mother? Because that is quite remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, well, no, is the simple answer to that. But of course, I haven't maybe spent enough time on the mother-in-laws. Yes, I mean, it is surprising in so many ways. And obviously, part of what I'm asking is to what extent can we step back from the narrative of famous historical events to look at the framework of the social world in which they happen? Is this to do with a personal relationship, as your question might suggest? Or is it to do partly with this incredible house she has and the fact that people are coming and going all the time at these regular kinds of social events? That means that this is a place where he can have conversations with people as he's collecting information and witnesses without people noticing. In other words, he doesn't want to have these conversations at his salutatio. Does his wife have tea parties of her own? Apparently not like the ones her mother is having. Now, obviously, it would be easy for someone to say that I'm pressing the text too hard. But at the same time, if you don't think that this is a work of science fiction, you know, that it has to be socially appropriate, then it raises a lot of questions about the interactions of the characters within the spaces, within different times of day, and what is plausible. But then you have to connect it up with all this information that's from much later, from the Ciceronian period, or something like the speech of Hortensia, which some people see as a real speech that was circulated, for example, in Bronwyn Hopwood's well-known article about this, but other people see as simply a fantasy of Appian's from a much later period. So there are a lot of methodological questions, a lot of social questions, and we get such rare glimpses that it is tempting to try to make the most of the examples we have, but then clearly it's easy to overdo it as well and say, well, look at how hard you're pushing this. You know, you don't know what is here an Augustan thing that's really from Livy, for those who want Livy to be a bit more of an active author. I mean, all I can say is I don't think Livy is the original author of making Posthumous the hero of this narrative. I see an earlier Posthumous behind this, and various other analytic sources, because in the inscription that we have from this time period, both consuls seem to be present in Rome paying attention to what's going on. But in the Livy, it's all about Posthumous and his relatives. So already we have some kind of narrative that predates, in my view, the Augustan moment. But I can easily see how someone might criticize that point of view.
Yes. Christina, please. Looks like you're on mute, Christina, sorry. Looks like you're on mute.
We can't hear you, Christina.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Harriet. That was a brilliant paper and I really enjoyed it. I had a question, but before, let me go to Federica's question on mother-in-law, which I think it's a very good question, actually. And in the hand that you already mentioned, Calpurnius Piso's mother-in-law,
Yeah.
From whose house Piso was watching the burning or the destruction. And I think, as you were saying, that this all behind is all these rich, powerful women. So when you marry into that family, you are also marrying that, as you have mentioned, and I love the term, that web of knowledge, and collections, and really you know, that is also part of the family, not only your wife, but also you have the mother-in-law, which
yeah. No, you get the whole package, I think.
Sorry about the cries if you're hearing it down.
That's okay.
Just two quick things. I love your prosopography, and I think it's very, very useful. And I realized suddenly when you're doing the prosopography that she's the grandmother of Fulvius Flaccus, the consul who died with Caius Gracchus. So
yeah,
when you start.
Already a point for Christina. I'm so glad you said that, because my husband says, oh, when he reads this is so boring. Nobody wants to hear this prosopography.
No.
But I've just found my audience here, Roman historians who are willing to engage in some of this work. Yes, because yes, I mean, does it matter which woman she is? I mean, I have to say, I'm such an admirer of Münzer and his work. I think he's just, an incredible guy. And so I hesitate to disagree with him where he's isolated this woman off into, her own space where we don't know who she is. But I do think it's quite possible that she's this special pious one. And Gravissima is not simply, oh, this woman is my mother-in-law, so she's really important, but rather that you could be a woman who had some kind of public profile, even at this date, as an individual. And therefore, it's interesting that somehow Livy, because Livy doesn't mention the statue of Venus Verticuria. And then that's a problem. So does that mean you need to put it chronologically outside the Livian narrative that we have, which is what Celia Schultz has suggested in her important book from 2006. And obviously that's one methodological way of dealing with it. And I just wanted also to give a shout out to, I was very lucky to be an external examiner for a PhD at Cologne by Anina Frankenburg on the term gravis in politics, which is actually a relatively rare word. So I got a chance to look at a lot of gravis examples. And of course, one of the rare positive words that can also be negative, and especially for a woman, because we may remember that Livia is a gravis stepmother for the house of the Caesars in Tastus, which is not a positive sentence, I'm pretty confident to say. So this woman is gravissima. There's virtually no other woman in a Latin text we have who's gravissima. So then I'm looking for a reason why she's so important, beyond just, oh, somebody, like it's not like a late imperial period where everybody has one of these titles that's in a superlative. Like we're trying to get back into the 2nd century here. So I'm rambling around a little bit, but I think I'm hope that I'm still addressing some of what Christina is saying. Christina, would you like to follow up? Yes.
Yes, because actually my question, and I love your point, was on the gravissima. So you have already anticipated it. And I really like how you put together all the different translations. And I was thinking in terms of, gender translation, when we have such rare or such adjectives to address as a woman. I mean, sometimes we see earlier translation, like 19th century, early 20th century translation, and we'll probably translate those terms very differently today because we are not we don't have the perspective of a 19th century male translator right now of women in politics in the Republic.
Right.
So I was wondering if there would be other examples and we can really rethink those terms and not use like the more like 19th century, early 20th century, maybe, I won't say sexist, but sexist at the end because they are very gender, very 19th century perspective.
So you don't like these translations. Are you talking about number 20 or you're talking more generally? Are you talking about these specific examples that I
both of them, right? Your examples and in general.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm just interested to see that these guys, I mean, I've only got 4 here. Obviously, we could collect a few more. I mean, these people know Latin, but they're having trouble translating this. They don't really know what it means. Because these translations are all very different. And I think the Walsh idea that it means reliable is, I mean, it's obviously a desperate measure here if gravissima means reliable. I mean, gravis for a man never means reliable. but I think that, yes, I mean, it's very difficult. And honestly, there are very few examples of gravis for women. There are some from Cicero's letters, and I don't have the references right here, but I can send them to you. But very few where he, in a greeting to a friend, he says, and greet your mother and sister, both gravis women from me. So casually saying gravis for a woman, but it's very rare. And I mean, also, of course, for a man, actually, things like, it's not as common, and it can sometimes mean over severe in the male context. I mean, I don't want to, present Annina Frankenburg's work as my own at all, but because I happen to be reading her work, it gave me a chance to look at lots and lots of examples of gravis, and I was working on this anyway. And it really helped me to think about like the word use and what's going on here. But to get back to some ideas about 19th century translations, I also wanted to point out something that Catherine Welch brought up at a conference in May in an important way, that many earlier Roman historians came from societies where women didn't own property in the way that Roman women did. And I want to give Catherine every recognition for giving a little talk about this. And in other words, one can mention Momps and the example she mentioned in her talk, but there are many of them. And so the idea of a woman owning a house and having access to the kind of material resources that I think we do imagine this mother-in-law of the consul to have, this meant something different to earlier historians. It was much more difficult to understand, just as the idea of no-fault divorce or some of these other things that seem to be developing in Rome was much more foreign. So we do need a different methodology if we're going to talk about these women. And I mean, obviously, what I'm also trying to get at is as an earlier time period from the Ciceronian one, which begs the whole question of, if we see the women of the Ciceronian period as doing all kinds of independent things, and then sometimes we say, this is a sign of culture developing or politics falling apart or the men leaving or being killed off. But we tend perhaps to overstress sometimes because we haven't spent enough time trying to look at the earlier ones. But I know there are some people who think that I would be much too optimistic in quotation marks. But this woman, Sulpicia, seems to me to be just taken for granted. And the fact that it's so much in the background of the narrative and often not commented on by people who are talking about, and we all know what the main themes are about the Bacchanalia. But what is the social frame behind these conversations seems to me to be very interesting. And as Federica already mentioned, suggests, family relationships, also easy relationships between a patrician woman and someone like Ibutia come to tea. And I'm not surprised, like, of course, this woman has asked me for to tea or a drink or whatever it is. And I show up, and then we have a conversation and we gossip about our family members and we do whatever it is we do. And then her son-in-law appears and I say, oh, hello. And he says, how is your nephew? And so, whether you think, whoever you think is setting whom up, it all somehow sounds extremely plausible. So it must be typical of such interactions somehow that are regular. Yeah, anyway, that's my point, which in many ways, of course, is not much of a point, but I don't think a lot of other people have made it before. I'm just pointing it out, yeah.
No, it certainly is a point, Harriet, come on. Now, as was, I think, safely predictable, we have a steady stream of questions and comments as well. There's a prosopographical comment from Eric Kondratiev in the chat, which I'm just going to read out, because some of us do like prosopography after all. Since Posthumous was consul in 106, 6 years before the Lex Viglia, it is possible that he was a bit younger than 42 as consul, in case this might be helpful for the prosopography.
Yeah.
Yes. But I mean, certainly also on a prosopographical note, I would say that for a woman who's clearly so central to the Fulvian setup, that is so predominant.
Right.
Of course, someone like Posthumous would have had to sit down for lots of cup of teas with her. And
Yeah.
yes, you can see all the chances of having indeed backroom conversations with her sons, who are clearly very much up and coming figures. And yeah, anyway, I'm digressing. Now we have a question from Henriette, and then there's a question in the chat, and I see other raised hands. So Henriette, please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Harriet. I very much enjoyed this, and I totally buy into the point about it having to be in some way recognizable. So I absolutely take that point. And I also really enjoyed the conversation you had with Christina about distorting factors. And one thing you may want to put into the mix, and this is before my question, but one thing that could be put into the mix about distorting factors in early 20th century scholarship is also the thought about what women talk about when they are having conversations. And they may not always be talking about knitting patterns or recipes or whatever. They can actually talk about really important stuff, like politics, as some of us also do when we have conversations in private. So then there may be also that element to it as well. But I was also thinking of another distorting factor, namely Livy. And I was thinking about this when you said something much earlier about the people who are put into this narrative. Obviously, if we believe that the whole Bacchanalian affair took place as we're being told in some form, maybe he couldn't sort of change the personnel very much. But I wonder then whether one could imagine some kind of influence from what Livy's generation thought might have been important figures 200 years earlier, well, 150 years earlier, so that their own thoughts about what might be relevant in the 180s, what their perspective on that period may have had some influence on how he puts it together, including the individuals. And I know you say, okay, he doesn't actually specify which Sulpicia, and that could be on purpose. Maybe everybody who reads Livy in his time knows which Sulpicia, or they think they do, because there's one Sulpicia everybody's talking about, or maybe that wasn't really relevant because it was an important woman. So I don't really have the kind of perspective on this, but I just wanted to raise a further distorting possibility, that is Livy and his generation and what they were thinking about that earlier period.
Yeah, well, that's clearly very important, the question of, and of course, this is exactly the same question that is posed about Cicero not specifying which Caecilia Metella has Sextus Roscius in her house. And clearly he knows the answer because it's a contemporary situation. And so people have argued about whether it is the person married to Appius Claudius, in other words, the mother of Clodius and the sisters, and yet the husband isn't mentioned, whereas other people say, oh, no, if this is a married woman and whom Cicero knows, he must mention the husband when he mentions her. And it's a kind of methodological argument already about that early speech of Cicero. And so it makes even more of an importance for something that Livy's writing about that's obviously much more at a distance to him. Yes, I mean, exactly. How important is this woman as an individual person, or does she stand in for a type? And of course, you could do this study either way, and it would still, I think, be a very interesting thing to do. The type of the rich patrician woman from this family who has a big house and who entertains a lot, it seems. and who has a lot to do with her family members. But you're right. And I mean, as a knitter, I absolutely agree. And of course, we all want to evoke the women who sit by the guillotine knitting. So, you know, there are many knitters in history who get overlooked, but I mean, it's partly the difficulty of exactly which are the interesting questions or the plausible questions to ask, and then which methodology is a sound one that you can use that doesn't lead you into a realm of creating your own story, as it were, because you want to imagine what it was like and you enjoy doing it, you know. And we all can see the temptation, especially with earlier material, where to what extent is it your job to fill in these gaps, or to what extent is it your job to say, wow, I have no idea who this woman is, and that's the way it goes, you know.
Absolutely. And just to reassure everybody, I can vouch for Harriet being a knitter, because last time I saw her in person, we were both in a knitting shop in Santiago de Chile, and afterwards in another shop where I bought a sweater that I thought maybe I should wear today just so that you could see it on me. But anyway, that's an aside.
Thanks very much. Now, we have a question that was typed in the chat by Bunny Waring a few minutes ago. I'm just going to read it out, and then there's Pedro Lopez. I've seen his raised hand. So Bunny's question goes as follows. I agree that the house seems to be a key element in Sulpicia's ability to, literally and metaphorically, provide sanctuary. Do you think there is any relevance in the areas of the house in which the conversations/information gathering took place, in contrast to visitors and areas of a male counterpart, for example?
Yes, I mean, I think that these are probably different rooms, and I was hoping that my talk would elicit just this kind of question. And obviously, one could go further, perhaps archaeologically, with trying to look at some houses from this time period, but it's pretty difficult. Also, of course, we're nearly always looking at the ground floor, and we don't see the upstairs of a lot of these houses, even in Pompeii, especially from like the 186. I do think that the interactions can also be seen from the point of view of space, that we have at least 3 spaces, none of which seems to me to be the atrium. But of course, some people have argued that the salutatio doesn't start until later in the 2nd century BC. And that therefore at this date, that men are not yet doing some of the things we see at the salutatio. At the same time, we remember that Gaius Gracchus was supposed to be the one who invented a more elaborate salutatio where you divide the people up in different groups, which also implies that you have different spaces which you can put them in, otherwise it doesn't make any sense. And of course, we have these scenes in people's bedrooms, scenes in various rooms early in the morning, but they're all from later. So then my problem here is, if I was going to make a comparison with a male counterpart, is to what extent can I even posit a salutatio? And of course I did in a sort of tentative way. Aebutius goes to visit the consul quite soon after he moves into his aunt's house to tell him initially that he's in trouble somehow. How does he do that? Does he send him a note, or does he show up at a regular meeting time? To me, that's like a salutatio moment. So I think you could also say, well, look, even if everybody doesn't have this open door policy that we think Cicero or other people have later, in the year when you're consul, you've got some office hours that people can drop in on, and you have to be more available at certain times when people can queue up and see you. Is it the same for women? Do they have an open house that's the same? Are their front doors also open in the same way during normal times? Because of course that's the whole thing where you close the door and you hang up the leaves because somebody dies, to show that the house is in mourning, or that you're not having a salutatio, or maybe you even have a body in the atrium. lying there is the exception to having the doors open, people coming and going, different times of day in different spaces. And I think that from the space point of view, this is also a very interesting thing, because it implies that you can imagine these social interactions in these different spaces, in a house that's therefore quite big and that has specific sitting rooms that you sit in at different times of the day, or that you receive people in, as the background to this, that it's not one of those super earlier atrium houses where you're either in the atrium or you're in a bedroom. Yeah, but that's just obviously me imagining these things again. Yeah, thank you, Bunny.
Yes, indeed. Yes, there's a follow-up in the chat. Pedro, please, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this paper, which I have very much enjoyed. I would like to introduce the juridical perspective, a juridical point about women ownership. The point is very simple. How could they own property? I mean, as filia familias, they would own no property as their male counterparts, their filii familias. As wife, as a spouse, they will have a dowry. This is the point I would like to introduce. And as we know that some cases of husbands having trouble when they had to give back the dowry, after a divorce, so they were substantial. So maybe this opens the possibility that these women mostly have property, substantial property, when they were widows. These women were mostly widows while they were married. Apparently, they do not have at least the control of the dowry, not at least beyond menacing her husband with divorce or something like that. But they don't. They don't have the management of their property. So this is more or less the point I would like, or the question I would like to pose.
Yes, well, I mean, I think we can see that this Sulpicia doesn't look as if she's married. And she's a woman of a certain age because her daughter is grown up, and the daughter's son is at least 10 years old, and he may not be the oldest. So that's why I posit, in trying to make an age table of her being maybe 50, which we all know is pretty old, right? She looks plausibly like a widow. But of course, that doesn't tell us what her situation was earlier when her husband was alive.
Yeah.
Nor do we know whether she lived in the same house with him. It could also be his house that she uses as under some kind of usufruct arrangement during her lifetime. I mean, legally, the situation is not clear. What is clear in the text is that Livy repeatedly describes it as her house, and she appears to be the person who is in control of the space, both from the social interaction point of view, and then also, of course, from the point of view of providing this apartment for Hispalia. And we're supposed to be able to imagine these apartments that are attached to these houses and that are regularly available, and that the rich person living in the main house decides who they want to either give or rent these smaller apartments to. And there suddenly it opens up a world of upstairs apartments that we don't often see, a world of outside staircases, because you're removing an outside staircase. I think it's very difficult to say legally what her situation is at that time. I mean, even if we imagine she has some kind of male tutor who helps her with her property, she certainly looks as if she's in control of it. And both she and Aibutia do seem to live alone. And she seems to have some children. I mean, I don't see how she could be his mother-in-law if he wasn't married to a daughter who's still alive during the narrative. I think if her daughter was dead, she would not be described as his mother-in-law. I mean, that's the way I see it. So, yeah, I mean, I think for someone like her, exactly how independent she is legally, it's very difficult to see the details. There are many ways in which she could either legally own the house or have use of it during her lifetime and make the narrative plausible. But apparently it's not very surprising to Livy, or, you know, depending on whether you want to play this game with whatever you think his sources are, that there she is as this independent person living in a house that's described as hers. And the idea that the consul then says to Hispala, I'm a consul, and this is the house of a very important woman, so I want you to get your act together. I mean, it would have been enough for him just to say, I'm a consul, you know.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have, before I hand over to Brandon Green, a comment from Tim Smith, who brings into the mix a potential comparandum from Pompeii, the case of the tomb of Vestorius, paid for by his mother, Mulvia Prisca. In the artwork she commissioned, he's standing in the atrium of what is presumably her home, since her son was 22 when he died. But only he is depicted in the artwork, so it's quite hard to locate her spaces for interaction. It's potentially...
Thanks, I didn't know about that one, yeah.
And we then have a bibliographical tip from Christina, paper by Lynn Foubert, from, you guessed it, 2016, on crowded and emptied houses.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But of course, this article really talks about later time. I mean, there's plenty of bibliography on the later time periods, which are better. And of course, it's a different world by the time you have Livia having her own salutatio. Yes, I mean, this is the kind of thing that happens that's, of course, very interesting in the Julio-Claudian period, that you do get women starting to behave in ways that men behaved before. And particularly women of this new so-called Domus Augusta behaving in these various ways. So it's a little bit difficult to say what it tells us about earlier time periods. Yeah.
Brandon, sorry to keep you waiting. Over to you.
Hi, Harriet.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks so much. So I know your talk is more interested in space, but I was hoping I could prompt you to talk about stuff and all the ornamenta that would have been inherited along with the house. Because you mentioned the imagines, which of course would have been not just they wouldn't just have added to her gravitas. They also would have been props for conversation or prompts for discussion. But then also, I guess first in a general sense, you got this woman's house, which is still presumably decorated with samnite shields and punic weaponry in the atrium. And so what does that tell us about the kind of gendered nature of the house, even after it's solely possessed by a woman? But then specifically for your case study, Catherine Welch has suggested quite reasonably that after the sack of Syracuse, that Roman patricians would start, or aristocrats would have started to store their embarrassing Greek spoils in exactly the kind of back rooms where your conversations are taking place. So what does it tell us that these conversations about the Bacchanalia are perhaps accompanied by Hellenizing statues and decoration?
Oh, very good. Yes. See, we need art historians and archaeologists to weigh in, because I'm sticking too close to the text. Yes, what do these rooms look like? Of course, it could also be outside spaces. I mean, we haven't discussed the possibility of a peristyle or a garden or yeah, something that's not even in the house. Well, I mean, what you raise again, I think, is the question of the atrium, you know, and I'm imagining these conversations as not being in the atrium. I don't know whether I'm right or I'm wrong, you know. But I think the most important point that you're bringing up, that's one that in a way that I haven't made very clear in this paper, is that even when a house is described by an ancient author as a woman's house, it is probably a family house. It is not really different from a man's house. So it is and it isn't a gendered space. And I think we have every reason to believe that in the atrium, we've got exactly the same stuff that would have been there before. And that the whole point is that these houses, as they change hands, or as they maybe are inhabited by different people without changing hands legally, perhaps, you know, to work in the Roman law angle, they are family houses that reflect the family as a group. Now, whether or not there are also rooms that are more feminine, where you have your tea party, that I don't know. And I'm not sure that anybody's really been able to think about that, because we have so little access to the occasions. You know, what is the space that goes with the occasion? We're both seeing just a sort of mirage of the time of day, the cup of tea, the setting for that occasion. I mean, there are some rooms we know they're not sitting in the kitchen, you know, we know that they're probably not sitting in a bedroom. So what kind of a room are they sitting in if they're sitting around and talking? It's very difficult, you know, to know what kind of room they're actually in. But so it's a teasing thing. And then you're absolutely right. Ideally, we would be able to furnish and decorate the room as well. And at this time period, we should see a lot of booty and a lot of ostentatious display, which is irritating people like Cato precisely at this time period. And that's being made fun of by Plautus and other people who are making fun of stuff. And that eventually provokes Alex Waconia to start reining some of this stuff in. So I haven't given a very good answer to your question. But yes, I think it was probably extremely elaborate. Yeah.
We have a question from Fiacra, who might take us closer to the text, or not.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me on my headphones?
Yes.
Thank you very much for a very enjoyable paper. And your paper made me realize that there are two sets of older woman, younger man or men in Livy's Bacchanalian narrative. The other set being obviously Pacula Annia and her sons Minius and Herennius, whom she initiates into the cult after she changes the initiation model. And this in turn makes me reflect that a certain amount of the scholarship on the interpretation of the clampdown, or the reasons for the clampdown, focuses or spends at least some of its energy on questions of gender politics, on social gender politics. And whatever you make of that scholarship, I know that it doesn't command universal assent. It is interesting to think about. It is interesting for gender to be integrated or to be part of the explanation of why the Senate reacted in quite the way they did, particularly in view of the fact that the new initiation rules get at these young men before they've reached their full majority. So in view of all that, I wonder whether you thought from a literary and historiographic point of view, there might be grounds for supposing that Livy intends a contrast between the wrong kind of relationship between the older woman and the younger man that we get with Pacula Annia, and the right kind of relationship between the older woman and the younger man within the family, even up to and including the correct use of family space and the correct use of civic space. So you could sort of bring your space argument into that as well.
Thank you for that. I think that that's very persuasive. Yes, I mean, I think obviously we don't want to remove Livy and he's obviously put a lot of effort into this whole episode, which is quite big and which is quite pushed to the front of a book, and we're supposed to be noticing it, and suddenly there are all these women who haven't been in the text before, and there are all these interactions, and they have speaking parts, they have all this agency. Hence, of course, the temptation of some people to try to say, oh, but this can't really be history. No, I think there's a lot going on there of how to behave properly, who are the people who tell you how to behave, who are the real Romans. And it's, to me, a typically Roman pattern that you have women with agency using the agency properly, not saying, okay, now we need to remove the women from the text again because we don't want them in here. But I mean, ironically enough, years ago, I actually published an article that was about the inscription. It was just about the inscription. And it's in a feshrift for John Graham, one of my teachers. And because it was actually, I mean, I wrote it in the 90s, and it's a gendered analysis of the inscription. And it was rejected by a number of journals in the 90s because it was a reading of how man and woman was used in the inscription. And one of the readers said, then Roman history is not about women. This is not a story about women. So even if this text says, let no man do this, let no woman do that. And my main text was, let no man enter a meeting of Bacchic women. What does that tell you? It tells you there's a meeting of Bacchic women, because otherwise there would be no point in saying, let no man enter a meeting of Bacchic women. And this reader said, no, you can't publish this. So, I mean, again, it's a kind of, I mean, what I really had wanted to do originally was write something bigger that involved both the text of Livy and the inscription, but then I felt like it failed. So I published a thing about the inscription ages ago, asking about gender roles in the inscription. And now I'm finally getting back to the text of Livy, trying to look at the background and trying to say, okay, what are the gender relations within the text? Why is gender central? And I think you can pose that without getting into the usual old chestnuts that you get into with this Bacchanalian question. How historical is it? And then you have people on either extreme, people who want to take everything literally, or people who want to say the whole thing is somehow a fantasy episode, and Livy hasn't noticed that it's a parody of I don't know what, you know, and then what would be the point of that? So yeah, I think you're incredibly useful in broadening it within the scope of what's going on in this whole episode. And the whole idea of foreigners behaving differently is often linked to the idea that their gender relations are somehow different. And of course, you get a certain amount of that in the Lucretia story already, with, you know, who are the foreign kings? Why are the women of the kings partying while Lucretia is sitting at her loom, because she's a real Roman woman and they're just Etruscans who are at parties all the time? And this kind of thing is very embedded in other Livian texts. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Roman Frolov, please.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thanks so much for the paper, for the discussion. Just a very short question. Going back to this interplay between normal and distinct, I was just wondering, we have here, if I understand your argument correctly, something which is presumed is a typical regular routine thing happening in this kind of houses, but then we have, on the other hand, a ready set of very effective, handy strategies, which are both routine, but also useful to solve a problem which is nothing but routine.
Right.
Very distinct, very particular problem of the Bacchanali affair. And so, well, a gravis problem. Yes, and I was just wondering whether, does it mean maybe that there were more situations of that kind than we know? Because they had this whole ready set of tools to deal with such crisis, also by using this kind of backdoor information channels for consuls or whoever, also with the help of women? Or does it mean maybe that, I don't know, maybe it is here where we can grasp the hand of Levy or whoever is responsible for using this very typical presumed idea of how conversations in women's houses could go, but also used to tell a very particular story of a very particular crisis, distinct crisis. I was just wondering whether this two things, distinct and routine, can tell us something about Levy, something about the political events, or something about women and their houses.
Yes, well, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to both look at something that is obviously a crisis of some sort. I mean, whatever you think it actually consisted of, it was big. I mean, when Livy says it's big, I think it must be big. And it seems that at the end of this, there is a deployment of the army in various ways. There is a use of special tribunals. There is going to be the death penalty. I mean, I take some of these things simply to be facts. And that's another reason why I think it's interesting that, yes, that you have both a particular moment where a consul needs to access certain information and certain witnesses, and then you have a setting in which he does it that is, you know, not a setting out of a spy novel. I mean, it's not a kind of Kim Philby, you know, although, I mean, I just read a book about Philby, and, you know, you can see some of these people as also, how do they interact? A lot of it was like over lunch and tea time, and like people who are collecting information and passing it on for political reasons, whether they're spies, whether they're government agents, whether they're, I mean, there are people who are trying to affect changes that are large and political. They often use the fabric of everyday life precisely because they're not trying to draw attention to what they're actually doing. And that makes me think that there is a world of these women's tea parties that lie behind this conversation that we have very little access to. And it's not because somebody's trying to silence it, it's just because it's in the background so it doesn't get mentioned. And the kind of sources we have, these things only are mentioned when they need to, when they come up. And of course, a lot of things, of course, then a lot of everyday things like the furniture, like the decoration, but like a lot of other stuff doesn't get described because the audience is already supposed to know what the social setting is. So we have to do more work to extrapolate that. So yes, I'm trying to do both of these things at the same time. Talk about a particular moment where a consul feels under pressure to take some action and by using witnesses. I mean, whether you think these witnesses, whether you think the whole thing is staged by him or not, in a way, it doesn't matter. And the everyday life of his interactions with his mother-in-law, her interactions with a lot of women. You notice that he says to her, "Do you know Ibutia?" And she says, "Yes, of course." In other words, he's asking her an opinion there that could be important politically also for him. And yet when he meets Ibutia, he does also seem to know her, or they are from a similar social background, So even if he doesn't know her in a personal way, it's easy for him to make conversation with her in a social setting because they somehow all belong to the same class. I mean, it also, of course, raises questions about interactions between, well, patricians and others and people who are of more equestrian background. And to me, this is a natural interaction where these people are very close to each other socially, and it's not at all surprising. Of course, he could have invited Aibutia for tea, but he doesn't want people to notice what he's doing. And this is a very easy way, apparently, for him to bump into her and say something. So that's the way I see it. But obviously, this is our reading of the text. And I may well be missing something. I'm sure I am missing some things that various either readers of Livy's sources or readers of Livy in his own day would have seen easily in what's a very carefully written narrative, where I think that the words are carefully chosen. Everything about it is very well done, and it's full of different meanings.
We have an intervention in the chat from Tim Cornell, whose computer has no microphone or camera, so he apologizes for that, and I'm just going to read out his intervention. Tim wonders what happens to Roman women when their husbands die. Do they continue to live in their husband's house, even if its ownership passes to a son, the new pater familias, or does she move into the equivalent of a dower house? I'm reminded, well, he's reminded, of a very peculiar passage in Plutarch's Coriolanus, end of chapter 4, where the hero continues to live in his mother's house, even after he's married and has children of his own. And the interesting point is that Plutarch mentions this as something unusual and contrary to normal practice.
Thank you, Tim, for that reference. Of course, it's difficult with a Plutarch biography about an archaic figure to decide exactly what it means. I think the example I would adduce immediately would be the example of Clodia, the widow of Metellus, as we see her in the Procailio. She's clearly still living in the house that she shared with her husband. And as Peter Wiseman suggested already in the mid-1980s, this surely is an indication that it was her house. I mean, there's another patrician woman who's very rich. So although she married a Metellus, she seems therefore during her marriage, he lived in her house. And I think that this is a possibility that has hardly been discussed in many situations, just because many earlier scholars weren't thinking about it. You know, they just weren't. Again, you have part of the question, of course, of a dower house is how many houses have you got in these families, and what suits you and what doesn't suit you. I mean, in another piece that I'm working on at the moment, I argue that Gaius Gracchus lived in the house of his wife Licinia, the daughter of the very rich Crassus, although that then raises the question of what happened to his house, particularly at a stage when he seems to be the only surviving child. Does his sister live in the family house with Aemilianus before she perhaps kills him off? Or is Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, keeping the house and not sharing it with her son? I mean, there are so many questions about these houses. But I mean, one point I would make that seems to me to be evident is we shouldn't underestimate how wealthy these people are. I mean, some of these people, they've really got quite a lot of inherited houses, and in each generation, they reshuffle them in whatever way suits them. But it is not necessarily the case, I think, that a woman who's a widow has to move into a dower house the way in, you know, Downton Abbey kind of situation is the norm. And so you see this patrician Sulpicia in 186, she's living in the big house. And regardless of whose house you think this was ultimately, whether it was her husband's house or her house, a house belonging to her father, you know, did she grow up in this house herself? Did it belong to an uncle? I mean, who knows? She's more or less alone, living as the owner and behaving like the person who controls the space, at least at this stage of her life. And that to me is part of the focus here of my interest, that this is a possibility that is clearly taken for granted and is in fact implied also for Aibutia. You know, here's Aibutius. I mean, he doesn't go and move in with a college friend, or, I mean, he has this aunt who's so convenient. I mean, these women are very convenient. Apparently, when you get into a difficult situation, Sextus Roscius, Aibutius, all these people who say, okay, where am I going to go now? There don't seem to be any hotels. Where do I turn? Do I approach somebody my own age? No, I approach an older woman who has a space and has enough money to, you know, where I can go and park myself for apparently quite a while without being a bore. Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting topic, obviously.
And so does Tim, who sent his thanks to
Thank you, Tim.
Other questions? Other comments? Well, it seems to me we had a wonderfully wide-ranging discussion.
Well, I'm very grateful for your comments. Please give me any other ideas you have, because I'm trying to finish this up and finally, and I need to try and fish or cut bait on quite a few parts.
Well, that was really a treat, and we are very grateful.
Thanks, guys.
To you for the paper, for the discussion, and indeed, thank you all for coming. We are reconvening, if you wish, in a week's time with a paper by Federica Lazzarini.
Oh no, Bertrand Roger, I think.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. Bertrand Roger, of course, Bertrand Roger, yes.
Yes,
indeed, Bertrand Roger. So we'll be talking about late Republican crisis and civil wars, indeed. Okay. Thank you all very much. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Good evening.